welcome to this edition of Tech Channel's Ask the Experts. I'm Dawn May. I'm a former IBMer, and I now work as a consultant in the IBMI industry. I'm also the president of Common North America, and I'm your Tech Channel moderator for today. I'd like to introduce to you to our guest, Andrew Finley from Rocket Software, who goes by Andy. I had the opportunity to meet Andy face-to-face at the Common Europe Congress in Prague this past June, so it's really great to be able to have met him and talked in person. Andy, would you like to give our attendees a bit of your background and what you currently do for Rocket Software?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Dawn. And equally, it was a pleasure to meet you too. And I thought it was a great conference there in Prague. I've worked at Rocket around 16, 17 years or so now. And I've sort of been focused within the sort of DevOps area. So working with what was back then, it was change management, then it became application lifecycle management, and now it's moved into DevOps. So that's my specific area, and I'm a solutions engineer. So I work with different customers across different industries, mainly around their software development, trying to improve their processes and make them more productive.
Oh, thanks for that. And with that, I'd like to introduce our session today. It's all about modern DevOps tool sets, and we're focusing more on the hows and the whens and somewhat on the whys. So let's get started. My first question really has two parts. Can you first give us a brief description of what DevOps is for those companies that maybe haven't gone down this roadmap yet? And then talk about the DevOps tool sets that you get from IBMI owners.
Sure, Don. Yeah, well, DevOps is essentially a methodology of trying to improve your software development processes. So it's a formation of development and operations, and using different tool sets and processes and like I say, methodology to help improve and produce better quality software. Now, when you mentioned like the tool sets that the IBM owners that they use, what we've noticed really from our customers is it's not necessarily about whether they want to adopt these new tools, but it's really a matter of when and how they go about it. The different organizations that I speak with, mainly IBMI, not all of them are on this modern development tools trail yet. And I'd say probably around 30% of them believe they know where they're going, but there's still about 70% that are still in the planning and the learning mode. So, but both of them are still coming to us and seeking help to try and implement new strategies.
So where are you currently with Rocket Software customers, and what can you tell us about their DevOps modern tool journey?
Well, a lot of the customers that I speak with, they're still using traditional sort of IBMI development methods. That's the 70% that I just referred to then. So they will modify RPG source code. They're using traditional source files, members, and so on. They'll compile them and move them to test and production systems. And they'll do that using, traditional 5250 sessions, or maybe RDI is their IDE, and some use other different ones, But I'm also seeing over the last year, 18 months, a number of other types of users. This is the 30%, and these are already on this modernization, modern tools journey. Some of them a little bit further on than others towards adopting a more modern approach to their IBMI development. And we don't really see anything wrong with either of these approaches. We don't see any kind of big switch that's going to happen overnight. No organization really is going to decide one week that they're no longer going to develop and maintain their core business applications using the tried and tested methods that they've probably used for the last 20 or 30 years or so. And then next week say, okay, we're now going to use a new editor to write all our code in, and we're going to offload all the source code off the IBMI platform into a third-party repository. We just don't really see it happening that way for a number of reasons. It could be a lack of resources. It could be a training considerations. They would have to adopt new processes. And all of those kind of things can take time to embed.
Yeah, and tried and true solutions are always good to make sure you transition and make a smooth journey, right? So, what are Rocket's recommendations to serve the needs of the range of your customers?
Well, that's why I think we're going along this where we say it needs to be a flexible approach. We think customers should have the flexibility to do both. Maybe you want to continue developing your traditional way for your core business applications, but you want to adopt a more modern approach for any new applications that come along, or for any connectivity that you want to use to go into the core applications, maybe utilizing microservices or APIs, for instance. So we think you should be able to do both and try and make this transition a nice, smooth, calm journey.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. What would you say are the main drivers behind looking at new and modern tool sets?
There seems to be a few different ones. It could be a number. I think the first one I'd say is modernization efforts. We're seeing lots of companies, adopt modernization efforts, and any application modernization strategy almost includes the use of APIs. And development in that area is often very iterative. It's very rapid. It's quick. But it's very hard to manage using traditional waterfall processes. So you've got to be agile, and you need the tools that will enable that agility. Or another big one we're seeing at the moment is related to the IBMI skills depletion. I think it's widely accepted, Dawn. You may have noticed this, that RPG experts, they're retiring faster than they're being replaced. And then the younger generation are coming in. They're expecting, or more sort of demanding, the tools that they use just simply work in an IBMI development environment. And not only for the languages that they're used to using, so for the Java and C++ and .NET and so on, but for the good old RPG and COBOL as well.
And this is an interesting angle, because if you have the right tool sets and going down a modern path, you can just hire a programmer and train them on IBMI. You don't have to hire somebody that has deep expertise. You can build that with new employees. So give us a sense, as we look at this, and other drivers behind the need for new DevOps tool sets.
Well, glad you asked, Don, because it could be other things like automation. Everybody wants to try and automate things for different reasons, reduce risk and error and so on. And automation's it's a key component in any modernization strategy. As I say, it will reduce the error rate, it will improve efficiency and give you consistency, and it will open up the IBMI to the rest of the organization and make it more acceptable to be able to use and connect into other applications. Automation is also a very good thing to enable you to encapsulate and enforce your compliance requirements. And the IDC believes that, reports in their stats that 70% of issues of errors that make it into production, the failures, are down to deployment errors, and only 30% of them are down to faulty code. So if we can do anything to try and enforce automation around the deployment, we can try to look at lowering that rate in the 70%. So automation's key, but in itself, although it does all of those things that I just mentioned, it does bring additional complexity with it, purely because you've got more configuration choices, you've got more integration challenges, more points of failure. So therefore, we need to look at good tooling in that area. And one last one I just wanted to mention, Dawn, was around compliance. One of these drivers could be compliance driven. We've been told by some of our customers that they plan to spend around 30% of their entire IT budget on compliance. So if we can find tools that will help in this area of compliance, so tools that are built to help with security, reporting, tracking, anything that's required to help with compliance and audits and give the auditors what they want, making a good choice in this area, tooling can only really help.
And with tools, there can be a lot of different options, and some tools might be more popular than other tools. Is there anything that you see bubbling up over the past year?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, in the area of DevOps, and the open source world, there's a stack of tools out there. But I'd say over the last, again, year to 2 years, I've seen a huge increase in 3 or 4 tools. So those being Git, Jenkins, VS Code, and I also see Jira being used pretty much everywhere now that we speak with. Now, in the grand scheme of things, in the 35-year history of the IBMI, these are all relatively new kids on the block, but they've been used in development areas on other platforms for a very long time. But now we're seeing them being introduced in an IBMI context, really, so that it can be used for true DevOps in the IBMI areas.
And I've experienced that too. And many of the customer shops that I've worked with, they are embracing these new tool sets. So can you go into a bit more detail on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, from we're celebrating the 35-year history of the IBMI. And as we all know, IBMI development processes in themselves are very mature. And typically they're common across different organizations. So you could go and work in one organization and they'll have very similar development practices and processes, most probably to the last place that you worked in. You'll usually find that the processes are understood, and sometimes, not always, but often quite well documented, and most of the time they're very efficient. But the issue is that the origins of them all stem from being based on waterfall methodologies. And we're now seeing a much more, larger desire to become more agile. And being agile means change. It means a change in process. It means a change in tools. It means more training. It may mean that required developers need, extra resources from other areas of the business. So bringing other people into those teams. So it might need reorganizing those teams and adding new people into that development process. And this goes back to your original question. This means DevOps, really.
Yeah. So, and when you look at these kind of changes, can you tell us more about these tools and requirements and how you can move this type of thing forward?
Yeah. I mean, any changes to methodologies required by DevOps and these tools like Git and Jenkins and VS Code and Jira and so on, it's not always a simple thing to do, and they require some thought and planning. So let's take Git, for example. I mean, Git itself is a fantastic distributed version control tool. It's been around for a long time now, since around 2005. And then it was started to be used on the IBMI platforms around 2015 and 2016, around then. And it provides developers with a really good way to code at speed and code safely. And it's got some really good functionality in it that allows developers to use functions called branching and merging, which basically allows multiple developers to work on projects simultaneously. And there's lots and lots of utilities out there in the open source world that just make using Git very, very easy. And then one of the others I've just mentioned there was VS Code. I mean, VS Code seems to very quickly become the editor of choice for lots of users that I speak with. It's been by Microsoft, it's free, it's open source, and it's this emerging technology that can now be used by IBMI development teams. So it's not actually that new. I think it came out around 2016 time. But there's now lots of extensions that have been developed in the open source world that are now available within VS Code that open it up to RPG developers. So they can go into VS Code and they can look at RPG programs, they can edit display files, they can use different plugins from vendors. It's got all of the syntax highlighting and checking for them. I mean, even down to like the function keys are the same as if you were doing Java or C++. They're the same if you're now developing in RPG or COBOL. So what that's done really is it's lowered the barrier. It's made the barrier of entry much lower for any new engineers that come in to develop on the IBMI platform. So it's just a great tool, and it's really easy to use. It's really good tool.
And Andy, I have to agree with you on this one. I am not a COBOL or RPG developer, but I do have to I edit utilities that I use. And I have found VS Code absolutely easy, a fabulous tool for those more casual kinds of projects. And so do you want to elaborate more on this?
Sure. I think it's really just it's this new generation of programmers who have been using it on other platforms, using VS Code. They can come in and into the IBMI development and they can just create and deploy code for the IBMI platform without really having to know that much about it. They don't have to know, they don't need the 30 years of knowledge about the IBMI platform itself. They can use VS Code and all the extensions to help them develop in this area. But with that, I also mentioned Jenkins as well, and this can be another one which can help in these areas. I mean, Jenkins is essentially one controller, and this controller manages a farm of agents. And the agents are basically the things that do the work within Jenkins. So you could install an agent on an IBMI platform, for example. When you first install it, you get one agent embedded, but then you can have a farm of agents across different platforms doing different things, trying to improve your performance. So things like Docker, for example, could be used for this really well. Most importantly about Jenkins, though, which you could use with VS Code to push things to Jenkins, the best thing about Jenkins is that this one controller can be extended. It's extensible by plugins. And there's a complete marketplace out there again with open source. And there's lots of different plugins that are available for you to plug into things like Jira that I mentioned, things like Slack and Maven, JUnit for developers, and also into lots of the software development vendor tools as well.
Wow, there's a lot to learn here. So it seems to me that there's not like one tool that does everything in this world of DevOps. And it looks like there's a lot of choices. So what are some of the best practices you've seen when it comes to how to use these tools to work together?
Dawn, that's very true. There are a lot of them. And I think the first thing to consider when looking at these modern tools is that it doesn't have to be, it shouldn't be thought of really as an all or nothing situation. You could implement the parts of the tools that make most sense to you, or for the company or the project that you're working on. If you wanted to explore the use of a new IDE, then maybe VS Code could be a good one to start with. As we mentioned, it's an easy one to start with. If you're looking at trying to centralize your scheduling, then maybe Jenkins is the one to try. Or if you're looking to maybe try, managing source code off the IBMI platform from standard source files and members and so on, then maybe try looking at, a Git repository. Or, you could do a combination here. You could use VS Code with Git or Git with Jenkins and so on. It's really, a matter of trying it and doing what really works for you.
That sounds like an exciting opportunity to go down that path. Your current customers are doing and what their goals are?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned over there, say the last year and a half, 18 months, I'd say, working with different projects, and a lot of them have changed into this modern development area. And right now, I'm working with several different organisations, and their common goal, if you like, is to become DevOps compliant by the end of this year for their IBMI development processes. And the drivers for these companies that I'm working with, honestly, right now, that they vary. So some of them are being told by the company that they have to adopt these new tools like Git and Jenkins and Jira and so on, as it's the company standard that they want to adopt. It's how all of the other applications in the company, the web and the mobile applications, are done. So they want their IBMI applications to be included in this. They're basically looking for standardization across the board. Others that I'm working with there's a level of curiosity. They're curious to see what benefits they will get from using these new tools. Will it help them to develop better quality software in less time and be quicker at releasing their changes, help them stay more competitive in the marketplace? And then there's the other reasons that I've sort of mentioned earlier, maybe skills related. They may be worried about skills depletion. So they're looking at tools which can be used by younger come in and replace them. Or it could be a desire to increase the level of automation. Or, it could be related to compliance and auditing again.
Yeah, so a lot of reasons, isn't there? My favorite though is the skills one, because when we hear the skills concern, if you adopt these modern methodologies and tool sets, as I already mentioned, you can just hire a programmer and they'll learn IBMI. Do you have other specific customer examples? You might want to do it. Of course, you can't name names, but if you have some real world examples, that's always interesting to hear.
Yeah, I mean, again, from these customers, like I say, that I'm working with now, real world examples. One recently told us that, their central system where they've got to trigger all of their builds. So a build being obviously a compilation in the IBMI areas for all of their platforms across the company has now got to be done by Jenkins. So we're working with them. Obviously, all of their web and mobile applications, that's already being done by Jenkins. That's triggering it and it's scheduling it from this central area. But they want to now include the IBMI builds in this as well. So we're working with them, to help them do this and come up with a solution. Another one that I'm working with has told us that, their requirements, their auditing requirements and their compliance standards that they're working to dictate that they've got to have automated code reviews built into their development life cycle, and the manual steps have got to be removed. And so we're looking at ways that we can do this with them. And there are a number of ways. Again, we could use some of the external products like SonarQube. As you move changes through your software lifecycle, you can integrate with SonarQube, which can then automatically review your code. You could do that with Git or GitHub. There's some other open source tools out there that will allow you to do this. Software vendors have got their own products, or we may end up using a combination of some or all of these as well.
And I'm back to that. Wow, there's so many choices. Have you noticed of any tools that don't work with IBMI, applications or languages? And if so, can you tell us about those?
Well, all of the things that I have mentioned, do work on the IBMI, but there's always certain limitations because many tools, well, really all of these tools, they've got many functions within them, they're feature rich, but they're only really good at one thing. Git for source code, it manages the source code really well. Jenkins will schedule and so on, So with Git, if we start with that, as I mentioned, it's a fantastic distributed source control tool, but there's other things to consider that it doesn't know about the IBMI platform, for example. You've got to think about the security aspects. How do you control who's got access to your source code? How do you protect that against malicious activities? And one of the ways you could do that with Git, that you can link them to some of the fantastic GitHub and GitLab and Bitbucket servers, for example. And they have security built into them, and even some auditing capabilities as well. So Git itself doesn't do everything. So you've just got to bear in mind that sometimes you might need an additional service on top of Git. Another one that we're finding we're coming across is regarding dependencies. With standard development, if you look at an object in production on an IBMI, I could look at it and see what it was, where the source code, which membranes, how it was compiled and so on. But if you're using Git, how do you know what source member it was come from, or where does that source live? So you may need that information sometimes to do troubleshooting or solving problems. So you've just got to look at ways where you can get that information from Git, into your IBMI.
And what about more about the compliance and auditing?
Yeah, I mean, that is always with any organization. It's not just the financial organizations that are concerned about, audit and compliance. It's always a top concern. So remember, some of our customers, they're saying that they spend up to 30% of their IT budget on compliance. So anything that we can do in that area to try and reduce that, can only help. So with this, you've got to be able to show the auditors, who changed something. Can you prove that? Can you enforce your local compliance standards? How are you going to make your auditors happy? Now, Git is going to satisfy your auditing requirements to manage the source code, but is it going to do it all the way through the software development lifecycle? So again, it's just things to consider. And with that as well, I think it's always linked this, to audit and compliance, is around QA, testing. How do you test your changes? In distributed platforms, it's really quite easy. You could be using Git for the source code. You build that package and you take that package and you give it to QA and you ask them to test it. But IBMI developers really work with small subsets, small objects, and then they'll put those objects with a group of other things that may reside in a library or a bunch of libraries in a library list. So you've got to think about how you're going to make that switch from using Git branches to versions and releases on the IBMI platform. And these are just some considerations that we're going through with some of these customers that I just mentioned, a few moments ago, the real life customers that we're looking at when they're looking at adopting Git.
And going back to Jenkins, can you tell me about some of the important things and when you want to evaluate Jenkins and give some examples?
Yeah, sure. I mean, whenever someone talks about Git, I think Jenkins is never far behind. It's always being talked about, and it is good enough to work on all platforms. It does work with the IBMI, but again, there's some challenges that we say to customers that need to be considered. Now, the principle of using Jenkins on the IBMI is totally fine. I could have some code in Git. I could push it to my GitLab repository, which would then use a webhook and trigger Jenkins to do something. Now, if that was just to put something on the IBMI, would be no problem at all. But if I want to look at something and compile that object on the IBMI, I need to know some information about that. I need to know, let's say, about the authorities to start with, not just I need to know about the user authorities and the object authorities. I need to know about the dependencies. If I'm changing a file, for example, I might need to, look at what programs use that file or vice versa. I may need to move it to different environments. It may need to be tested in several environments, and those environments need to be built. Do they have the correct library list? And then you've also got to get it there. You've got to deploy it there. So although Jenkins can do all of those things, can trigger to do those things, I've actually seen customers that have wrote themselves all that thing I've mentioned. So it will work out the authorities, work out the dependencies. It will deploy the files or the programs to the correct environments, but it's taken them a very, very long time to do. And then you've also then got to think about the maintenance. But, it is doable. You could do that. But it's just some considerations, again, Dawn, to think about when you're using Jenkins.
So given all the things that you've talked about today, can you summarize the key considerations for adopting these new technologies, these new tools, how, when, and maybe some of the whys?
Sure, yeah. I would say, don't think that you've got to do all of this at once. Remember the IBMI development is been embedded for a long time. So I would say try it, get used to it, get used to the tooling. Maybe start with VS Code. It's simple, it's great, it's easy to do. If you want to go more agile, maybe start looking at more DevOps tools. Maybe you don't need Jenkins. Maybe you do. This could be a company, like I say, with some companies which they're being some more sort of forced to as a company standard, but don't think it could be something that you have to adopt. Try things out. You may have to use it, you may not. VS Code, I would say, really is the main answer here to a lot of the challenges that I've talked about today. About how do you lower that barrier of entry for your younger generation that are coming in to develop on your IBMI platforms.
And so how would you conclude everything you've taught today, or summarize today's exchange?
I'd basically conclude by saying that the IBMI platform, you can do development, and it plays very, very well in this modern IT environment. You could use all of these tools that I've mentioned today in an IBMI development area. I think, but for optimal efficiency, it's really best to be used in conjunction with a good DevOps tool. That's how I'll conclude it, Donna.
Yeah. Thank you, Andy. I'm really impressed. It was great to hear Rocket's approach to DevOps and its customers and the successes across the board. And with that today, Andrew Finley, who's Rocket Software's senior pre-sales solution engineer who focuses on application lifecycle management with enterprise organizations, mainly based around the software development lifecycle. That was a mouthful. For more information, you can visit www.rocketsoftware.com/product/rocket-devops. And with that, Dawn May, I'm your Tech Channel Ask the Experts moderator for today. And I hope you've enjoyed our conversation with Andy and Rocket Software, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.